The sermon title today is Ordinary Time, and I want to apologize if my presentation today will be subpar or not on the standard that I would like to do it. Those of you who are familiar with what I try to do in a sermon is that I don't use a manuscript, or it's here, but I don't use it, but today I will have to do it, so this will be sort of a new experience for me. I don't have it in my mind, it's too foggy, so I'll have to consult what I've typed out here, and I apologize if it's not that fluent. Ordinary time refers to certain periods in the church calendar when there's not a major event associated with that time, like Christmas, where you think of Advent, or Easter with Lent around it, and in this particular time, Epiphany, which if you are in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you think of Epiphany as having to do with the wise men, the three kings, and in the Western Church, more with the baptism of Jesus. Jesus being revealed as the Son of God, according to our tradition. But we find ourselves in ordinary time now, suggesting that this is not really important, and to me thinking of, okay, we have to tread water until we get to Ash Wednesday, which is the beginning of Lent. It may be ordinary time on the church calendar, but I think the few decades that we happen to inhabit, the few decades right now that we are present in and that we live in, and that includes you Scouts especially, and the young people, but all of us, these decades are not ordinary time in any way. These decades are decisive decades, years, a time that those to whom we leave this planet will follow us, will look back, and will ask, what did you do in that time? What were you busy with? What were your priorities? What did your life consist of? What were you doing then? Consequential, important time that we are living in. If we take a quick look at Psalm 139, it is a psalm that, with its soaring poetry, invites us into the world of the poet that describes the overwhelming weight of the realization that God is present with him always, but that presence to him is a burden. A burden because he experiences God's presence requires of him to give account of what he is doing. God's presence requires of him to say how he is responding to what he encounters in life. And it is a very human poem. I think if we are honest, we can see ourselves in this poem, because it describes, in these beautiful verses, the soaring imagination and the beauty of it, of a love for God and God's creation and God's people, but also on the other end, as it calls it, a perfect hatred for those that do not love God. And we may say, well, I'm not exactly there. I don't have a perfect hatred, especially not for those who do not love God, because I'm not that religious. But it describes a dichotomy, I think, that we carry in ourselves of the potential for either good or evil, of what is life-giving or what is life-destroying. I read this psalm, and afterwards I became aware that on Tuesday it will be the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. That one of the most effective death camps of the Nazi regime. And I read an article in my little bit of reading that I was able to do about the Holocaust. And I read an interesting article by an author with the name of Howard Jacobson. And in this article, he wrestles with the question of how to speak about the Holocaust, if at all. I want to read to you his introductory paragraph, part of it. He says, "Silence is the angel," I think referring to Jacob's wrestling with the angel at the river Jabbok. "Silence is the angel with which literature wrestles. The silence of inadequacy to the task of expression. The silence of moral hesitancy or humane consideration. The silence enjoined by the laws of blasphemy or fears of persecution. The silence of bad conscience or exhaustion. The silence of tact." Harsh words, I think. He continued to say that for many authors trying to speak or think about the Holocaust, silence or reticence became a moral obligation. The German philosopher and author Theodor Adorno said, and it is a famous quote of his, "No poetry after Auschwitz. No poetry after Auschwitz." And Jacobson says, either way, it didn't simply mean no fancy language. It meant no rushing to the process of articulation or even to explain what might have been beyond explanation. And then he quotes Dostoevsky, Fyodor Dostoevsky, who said, "I'm afraid of one thing, that I won't be worthy of my torment." And Jacobson says, thinking of Dostoevsky's word, that we have a double obligation. We who never experienced the torments of the Holocaust, we bear a double obligation. First to those who experienced that torment, and then to our own capacity to imagine that without false solace. Perhaps we should be guided by the thoughts of Holocaust survivors to guide our thinking about the Holocaust and to guide ourselves in also thinking about it, but speaking and perhaps acting in this time. Elie Wiesel, one of the famous Holocaust survivors, said at the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, he said, Auschwitz produced a mutation on a cosmic scale, affecting man's dreams and endeavors. And he said, after Auschwitz, the human condition is no longer the same. After Auschwitz, nothing will ever be the same. I don't think Elie Wiesel was right. I think he was optimistic. And why I say that is, I think it is human for us, for survival, to tend to forget the horrible and the horror. And I look at myself, and I shared this with the One Bible Study group. My military training, when I was in South Africa, we had to do 2 years of military training. And I did mine as a chaplain, but first we had to do basic training, then officers training, and that chaplain's training. And that basic training was harsh. It was one of the most horrible times in my life, because basic training is designed to break you down to almost nothing as a person and then reconstruct you so that you are willing to kill somebody else in the name of whatever. And that process is devastating. It's really very effective. It breaks you down. But when I see some of my old friends, very rarely because of the distance between us geographically, but when you see each other, you remember the good times of basic training. In our minds, we reconstruct it and we cherry-pick the good things. And I think collectively, as a species and as societies, as communities, we also tend to do that with history. And it is confirmed by Pew Research Center, a recent survey this year. Survey among American adults, where they found that only 45% of American adults can name correctly the number of Jewish people that were killed in the Holocaust. Only 45% of American adults in this age, this time, can say that it was more or less 6 million. Looking at what I said, that we should be guided by the words and the thoughts of survivors, how to respond to this tendency. Viktor Frankl is another famous Holocaust survivor. He spoke about the experience in those camps. And he said of those events and his experience, we need to stop asking about the meaning of life, and instead to think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life hourly and daily. And he said our answer must not consist of talk and meditation, but in right action and right conduct. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answers to its problems and to fulfill the task with which it constantly sets for each individual. Elie Wiesel again, he said, I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And Yehuda Bauer, another survivor, thou shalt not be a victim. Thou shalt not be a perpetrator. But above all, thou shalt not be a bystander. In this time, that in my mind is some of the most consequential decades in the history of humanity on this planet. Let us be guided by these thoughts of people who were there, who experienced it, who survived it. And also by what we read in that Psalm 139 and acknowledge the potential within each of us to go either way. And let us embrace this prayer, the last few verses of that psalm. Examine me, O God, and know my mind. Test me and discover my thoughts. Find if there is any evil in me and guide me in the everlasting way. It would be terrible if this is where we depart. If this is where we say everything has been said. Even though we are encouraged to appropriately rather be silent and be quiet about something like the Holocaust. And one can add other horrible events and sequences of events that have occurred since then. It is also true and part of our reality, fortunately, that the most noble things produced by the human spirit, the most beautiful things we create, the most praiseworthy and the best things we do from every perspective happen when we are confronted with something that is terrible and under the most difficult circumstances. Something in the human spirit responds, fortunately, most often with something good. And I think it is important for us to remember in these days that heroism and life-changing actions and an epic life is not confined to those miraculous, newsworthy, impressive lives and actions and events. It is like a river that gives life and brings life, where billions of droplets of waters combine to form a mighty river that brings and gives life. And therefore it is important for us to remember every life matters and every action of us, whether we are a scout master, whether we are just a regular guy in town, going to school, perhaps going to college, going to work, living through everyday life, that our life, my life matters and can make a difference. And it does make a difference even if we don't think so. And I invite you therefore with all my heart, after being open to living with the moral compass that we find in the Word of God, the great commandment of love for God and love for thy neighbor, to also remember that second passage of the salt of the earth, where Jesus called us to say, remember, you are the salt of the earth. And remember, you are like a city on a hill that cannot be hid. And let us be that city on the hill. Let us be that light. And let the light that we are as individuals, as a group, as a covenanted community, as a nation, in these decisive times, let that combine, and let us walk and accept with joy into the future that can be a new dawn and not the abyss of darkness. May God's Spirit guide us and lead us in this extraordinary time. Amen.